Smriti, shall we?
Yes, I think we can get started.
Okay, right. Good morning, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this Ask Me Anything session of WIC. I am Pratima Sharma, co-founder and director at WIC. With me, I have Smriti, our founder and CEO. Smriti and I will be speaking to all of you about bringing every orphan child in India into a family through adoption. We'll take you through our journey of working in Maharashtra and Telangana and bringing orphan children into the adoption pool. We'll speak to you about the resources, the funds that we need, and also how each of us can contribute in the cause. But before we get started, just a couple of things to keep in mind. This is in a webinar mode, which means all of you will be muted. I will start with a short introduction of the work that's happening within WIC, and then the floor will be open for questions. You can use the Q&A section, which is created. You'll see a button right below, and just type anything that comes to your mind. Please feel free to ask any questions or any questions that you have got. And we'll try our best to answer as many questions as we can today. We are recording the session, and the recording would be available on all our social media channels. Pune is facing the full onslaught of monsoon, so in case we lose power or the internet gets interrupted, don't worry. Please be patient. So let me start by telling you about Sakshi. Sakshi was found at a railway station when she was 5 years old, hungry, alone, confused. Her family could not be traced, and she was placed in a child care institution, what we know as orphanage or shelters, where she languished for 4 long years. It's worth knowing.
I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you for a second.
Yes.
I think there is a lag. The voice is breaking. So let's just ask people if they can hear you. And so I asked if you can hear Pratima all right. One person can hear you, another person is saying no. And one person is saying voice is breaking, and some are saying they can hear you. So it's a mixed
Just give me 1 second. What I'll do is I'll try changing the internet connection and see if it works like that. Yeah. Smriti, can you hear me now?
Yes. So
yes,
try again.
I'll share the screen. Yes. Let me start with Sakshi again. Sakshi was found at a railway station. She was 5 years old, hungry, alone, and confused. Her family could not be traced, which meant that she was placed in a child care institution, what we know today as orphanages or shelters. She languished there for 4 long years. It's worth knowing that there are 4 lakh children residing in India's shelters today. Many of them abandoned, orphaned, surrender, or even with guardians who are either unwilling or incapable of taking care of these children. And there are many, many Sakshis residing in the shelters amongst these 4 lakh children. In fact, many reports of the government, NGOs, and even our own field work tells us that 3 out of every 10 children living in a CCI should be evaluated for adoption eligibility. Now, you might wonder, why not the rest 7? The law in India clearly states that unless we can prove that there is no one to take care of the child cannot be evaluated for adoption eligibility. From our work, we found that 3 out of 10 children are clear cases. These are cases where we can quickly process these children and put them to the adoption pool. The rest 7 could be gray, complicated cases. But it gets more unfortunate than that. Only 2 out of every 200 children are getting evaluated today. And why? And on the other hand, over 36,000 registered couples and singles wait for an average of 3 years to adopt. And many more get discouraged. They resort to illegal adoptions and other means. But you might wonder why. Why does this happen? It's worth understanding that in 2015, adoption laws in our country went through a big change. Now, as per the Juvenile Justice Act and the adoption regulations, any child between 0 to 18 years of age who has nobody that can take care of the child can be processed for adoption. But our infrastructure, the child care institutes, the district child protection units, and the entire implementation machinery that should have implemented this law is yet to catch up. What we find is a general apathy towards the topic of adoption. What we find is a lack of even basic understanding at the shelters as to how to process these children to come into the adoption pool so that they can eventually be matched with the waiting parent. CARA, which is the central body of WCD, the Child Adoption Resource Authority, is responsible for matching these children with waiting parents and do the entire due diligence of the family. However, they also fail to do their job because there are no children that are reaching in the adoption pool. Out of the 4 lakh children, today nearly 2,000 make it to the pool. What also happens is status of legal guardians of the children is very unclear. A lot of times, living relatives of an orphan child, chacha, mama, would send the child to a shelter, mention their name as the legal guardian, and then never turn and look back at the child. What has now happened is that the name of a legal guardian appears, but there's no way to prove whether that guardian would ever come back and take care of the child. And because of this lack of clarity, the children are in a limbo and they stay stuck in a shelter. The shelters have a thought that it is sufficient for an orphan child sometimes to have a roof over their head, 2 meals a day, and an opportunity to go to school. The right to family is not being recognized for these children. If any of you today were to walk into your district WCD commissioner's office, the Women and Child Development Commissioner's office today as a citizen, an aware citizen, and ask him or her, Madam, sir, how many shelters do you have? How many children in these shelters? How many adopted? How many abandoned? What are the numbers? No one would be able to answer because somebody will have to physically go looking at each and every file and count these children. Despite the progress we've made in our country in digitalization, the digital India, this is one area where technology has not been used to its most effective. There's complete lack of tracking of abandoned and orphan children at CCI. There is actually no count. Even the 4 lakh number ebbs and flows, changes. It's very hard to say what's the exact number. We just know there are lakhs of children because different reports give you different numbers. And also, one last thing is there is no incentive for CCIs to promote adoption. Today, the government actually gives every CCI 2,000 rupees per month per child. They're almost being incentivized to keep the children with them, not being incentivized to process them for adoption. And that's where these children get stuck. But there are solutions, and which is what we've been trying to do in the past 6 months. The solutions that we came up with, a big part of it is technology. We think extensive fieldwork enabled by technology is the first step. We have to digitize records of these 4 lakh children in the CCI. We have to process these records and find eligible children for adoption and process each and every case by making sure that all the documentation is complete. Their medical tests, their social investigations, police reports, ads that have to go in papers, searching for a biological family, all that is complete, and a strong case is built for them to be put across to the Child Welfare Committee, who finally takes a decision on declaring a child legally free to be adopted. A big area is training and sensitization. We need to train shelter owners, trustees, social workers, district child protection unit officers, child welfare committee members to understand what's the meaning of right to family, how important it is for a child, and then make sure that they are able to process these children for adoption as quickly as possible. And finally, we need policy changes. We need judicial intervention and massive public awareness to even understand simple things like the definition of an orphan. The number of times adoption inquiry should be done on a child. Should there be things like a minimum visitation requirement on the family and questions asked to the family if they are not visiting and gradually abandoning a child at a shelter? Many things can be done there, and we are trying our best to do research and interact and engage with the central WCG department to put across changes that should be brought about in the adoption laws and the policies. In the last 6 months, Maharashtra government and Telangana government gave us an opportunity to run a pilot of this solution in 2 of their districts, 2 districts in each state. We assessed files of 3,650 children, making them visible to the authorities. Once these data were created, our field workers ran the technology, ran the rules engine, and find out flagged children. We almost found 700 to 800 children who could be potentially made adoptable. Every child was picked up and our field workers started working on these cases. A lot of things had to be done. And now I'm happy to say that more than 100 children were declared legally adoptable so far. There are many files to look at even now. And out of those, 20 have been adopted into forever families. Another 10 have been reserved by international PAPs to come, who will be adopting these children. Now, based on the results that we've shown in Maharashtra and Telangana, both the governments have given us pan-state approval to go and visit every shelter and make sure all records of children are digitized and assessed for adoption. We are gearing up to get this done now across the states, Maharashtra and Telangana. And what happened to Sakshi, you might ask, because that's how we started, didn't we? And that's a very happy story. After 4 years of being in a shelter, Sakshi's case was flagged by our technology solution. One caseworker was assigned for Sakshi's case. We completed her paperwork, made sure all her documentation was complete, and presented the case to the District Child Welfare Committee. She was declared legally free to be adopted, and she was adopted, and she has reached her forever family. You can help every Sakshi reach a forever family by supporting our work. This is who we are: Smriti, Meera, and myself. All 3 of us adoptive parents. I've got 2 daughters through adoption, 7 years old and 3 years old. Smriti had 2 daughters, 8 and 9 now, I think. And Meera has 1 bio kid and 1 son through adoption. 3 of us got together in July 2019 and realized that the problem is much bigger than just counseling parents on adoption. The problem is how to make sure that eligible children continue to move in the adoption pool and don't languish in the shelters. We have been supported by Maharashtra and Telangana, and we're doing extensive work with them. We've been running massive public awareness campaigns for safe surrender and trainings for government and non-government bodies. Our field of work is technology-enabled field work in the area of adoption, research, public awareness, counseling, training, and we also do extensive policy research to be able to suggest to the government what changes have to be brought in to make sure that right to family is always restored for the child, and whatever happens is in the best interest of the child. It cost us 12,500 rupees to process 1 child like Sakshi for adoption eligibility. This covers many things like the field worker's salary, medical test, the money that we have to pay for putting an ad out to look for a bio family, and many other small things that have to be done for the child to make sure that the process and the papers are complete for the child. You can donate through Razorpay or a bank transfer. We also take monthly auto debits. All donations are tax exempt under Section 80G. I will stop here. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me. I think we've started getting some questions, so we'll try and see whether we can try and answer some of this for you.
So Pratima, would you like me to read out the question and then we can answer?
Yes, Smriti, let's go for the first one. Yes.
Sure. So one of the first questions is, how can there be a non-corrupt way to find that children are abandoned so they don't languish in shelters and only get picked up from relatives when they can work? Basically, I guess the question is there, how are you determining that the children are abandoned, and is there a non-corrupt way of doing it? So shall I?
Yeah, you go for it, Shruti.
Okay. Yeah. So Sarah, that is what is currently laid down as checks and balances in the current system. So yes, there is a current non-corrupt way of doing it. If a child is abandoned, whether if a child is abandoned on the child's file. First, you have to check whether there is a legal guardian listed. Second, is that legal guardian traceable? Third, if the legal guardian is not traceable, or are they visiting the child? So there are few things you can start out on a file to check whether the guardian exists, whether they are traceable, or and are they visiting the child. So if they don't exist or they are not traceable, and they're not visiting, then you can pick up that file and you can start with first, if reaching out to the guardian if they're available. If not, then the process starts. And the entire process of determining that the child is abandoned and should be brought into the legal adoption pool, that is where all the steps that Pratima mentioned on the ground need to happen, such as getting a police report, doing a newspaper publication of the child, getting a NOC from the local district child welfare committee, because they do a social investigation to see if the child has somebody. So there are steps on the ground. The issue today is that there are laws, they are on paper. In practice, they are not implemented for children once the children is in a shelter, comes into a shelter. So nobody triggers that process. Nobody follows through on that process. A lot of it is, issues with resources, then mindset, and then, not having proper training. But yes, the method exists. It's a matter of implementing it. Okay, Pratima, you want to add something, or we can go to
No, I think that's good, Shruti. I think, do you want to take the next one? The question from Radha is there a limit on the time the shelters wait for the legal guardian on file to turn up before starting the process for adoption?
So Radha, it's actually the other way around. If there is a legal guardian on file, then the shelters never process the child. In fact, the local authorities never process the child. There needs to be a timeline. There needs to be a timeline which says if you don't show up or meet your kid or don't contact your child for 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, whatever the timeline is, then we have to kick off the process of determining whether the child could potentially be eligible for being legally adoptable. So yeah, the problem is the opposite. It's not that they're not waiting. The problem is that they're waiting forever because there's no threshold.
Okay. How about this one? Let's take Priya's question. Currently, how long does it typically take to fulfill all these steps, and what and how can we do? Can we minimize this so that more children can come into the pool?
Sure. So Priya, there are two ways of answering that question. The law basically says all of this should happen in 4 months, right? From the moment the child comes into the shelter, it should happen in 4 months. But what we see is that children are sitting in shelters for years altogether. So it's obviously not happening. Now, once we start working on a case, I would say end to end, it may take about 4 to 6 months, because it really depends upon how the other stakeholders, how quickly they do their part. So for example, if we have submitted a request for a police report by getting an order from child welfare committee, how quickly do we get the report from the police? If we give a child's completed file to the local district child protection unit, how quickly would they issue a NOC? So some of the dependency are on local authorities. We do continue to follow up. So I would say maybe you can say 4 to 6 months is a reasonable timeline once the process starts. So the challenge is not more in terms of these timelines can be further reduced, but currently the bigger challenge is to start out these things, to look at children and say, hey, let's start this child's process, let's complete this child's process. And how you can minimize it, we can minimize it. See, one thing is, as an NGO, we are working in this space, but the other way this gets minimized is some perhaps top-down target setting or will. So for example, we know loosely 30% of the children should be evaluated, at least. If we go with the current law, at least 30% of the children should be evaluated. So if there is a top-down, let's say, mandate or top-down evaluation within the government structure of whether 30% children have been evaluated. So those things can essentially make things faster if there are stronger government mandates and stronger government will.
Okay, I'm going to just pick up another one which is related. I think it's a good question. Let's try this, Shruti. Can you elaborate how the funds will be used by WIC through the year, various levels and various projects? I can start, Shruti, and you can add. So thanks for that question, Anushree. Immediately, our need is to ramp up resources for Maharashtra and Telangana. Both these governments have been extremely supportive, and they've given us access to go and visit every child shelter, which means we need to hire field workers who physically visit these shelters and digitize the records. So our biggest outflow today is salaries of field workers, and also making sure that they have the right resources like laptops, their travel is taken care of, etc. Another big area we have to work on is how do we make sure that we release an upgraded version of the technology that we've developed. So far, this was in a pilot basis. It has given us the results that we wanted, but there's so much more that can be done. We want to be able to add a very large number of children on the database, which means we need to release the second version and upgraded version. So these are the two big areas. Shruti, anything else?
No, I think that really covers it. I think those are the areas we are focused on, just growing, our team of field workers and making sure that their travel, their salaries, all those things are covered. Organizationally, we also want to grow. We want to build, other teams. But I think our current priority is scaling in the two states. Okay.
So there are a couple of questions from international PAP. So let's take that. Okay, let's try and see if we can answer these for you. Radha again asking, does your organization play any role or plan to play a role in post-reservation process? I'm an international PAP and I've been observing that even after a match is made, it takes long time, more than 4 to 5 months for the children to come home, mostly because of delays from the courts. Shruti?
Sure. So Radha, to address that, whether they play any role in the post-reservation process, so we don't. So our role is essentially, so we work with child shelters, we work with local government authorities, we work on making sure that children come into the legal adoption process and then get uploaded to Carings, which is the CARA's system. So we make sure that they go into the CARA database. After that, the matching and the process after that is done by CARA. So you're saying that it takes a long time. You're absolutely right. There are court delays. And I believe CARA had issued a change where district magistrates, the DMs, could handle adoption cases and they didn't have to go through the local family courts. I believe that's not being implemented yet. I think it is out as a ruling, but it has not, it's not being practiced yet. So hopefully we'll have to see if that changes this timeline. But you're right, it's an issue, but that's a place where we don't play a part there.
So let's focus on the question where we have a part. So what is the role of WAC technology in pushing the children? Now, why don't you talk about that a little bit, Smriti? What does the system do?
Sure. Okay, so let's talk. So technology is always an enabler. Right. So we're talking about children and working in children's area. So we'll always need humans and field workers and social workers to handle the cases. But what technology does, it creates transparency. It creates tracking, and it makes sure that every child is visible. So I'll give you a quote from one of our partners. So one of the NGOs, they started using our technology to look at the children and CCIs in their district. And this was a specific adoption agency that was linked to child shelters in their district. And so they started using our technology. And the first comment they said was, finally, we know where the children are and how many and who they are. So I think that's what essentially technology is doing. It's making sure that everything that is manual doesn't get lost. Today, if we collect data of 100 children on files, we process, let's say, 20 of them. What about the remaining 80? They'll get lost again. What technology does, it makes sure that every child in a shelter is accounted for, is visible in the technology system, and long term that child can be tracked and the work can be made transparent. How many children are there? How many were flagged? How many came into the legal adoption process? The ones who didn't come into the legal adoption process, what was the reason? So the technology allows us to track all of that clearly, and it allows us to scale. When we go from 2 districts to 20 to 200 to 700, technology will allow that scaling so that no child is left behind, no child is invisible.
Thanks for that, Smriti. I hope that answers your question, Santhana. We're getting so many offers for volunteering. I was so happy to see that. Thank you so much for offering to volunteer with us. Definitely, if you just write to us at team@wic.in, we would get back to you on any volunteering opportunity that we have and take it from there. Not able to answer that question right now in this forum, but we can always take it on. We're always happy for any kind of support that we get.
So There is one more. I'll read this one out from Anushri.
Very good question, Smriti. Try the seven questions. You mentioned that government is giving 2,000 per child. That's a very good question to answer.
Can you read that out?
It says, as you mentioned, that government is giving 2,000 rupees per child to the agency. Hence, when we visit the shelter, we see lots of children still in shelter. After your last year's effort, can you help us understand what action government is taking towards this?
So I would say, first of all, it's very difficult to predict or read or talk about government actions, because obviously we are not in the know specifically there.
Yeah.
I'll say that there is sort of this, perhaps this growing understanding that many times lots of kids are ending up in shelters, but they're not going long term to families, and it's better for a child to be with a family long term. Now, many kids who are in shelters, they could perhaps, many government has some sponsorship programs so that their biological families can raise the kids, but there are many other kids who are not going to go back to the biological family because either the family doesn't want them, or it's not safe, or the family is not even available, traceable, and so on. So there's so many other reasons. So I think we see a growing understanding of, a child living their entire life in a shelter is not good for the child. And if you see it from a government perspective, right, they are putting so many funds. They're putting so many funds and resources, and I'm not just talking about money, right? You also need to make sure that the children are not abused. So you need district child protection units to keep on visiting the shelter and the kids. Yet, despite these resources, children come out of these shelters, unprepared for life. And I'm talking about average shelters. There may be some really good shelters, but many but if you look at it, right, most these shelters would be very average places. And so if you look at that, so government will put so much money in keeping these kids safe, educated, fed in shelters, but they'll come out of this entire experience, and they're still entering the society unprepared for life, undereducated, and very, very underprepared. And obviously that the entire psychological toll that not having a family has on a child, and having that stay with you for the rest of your life. So I do think the government is understanding that. Now, have they taken any concrete action towards it? It's hard to say. We see an understanding, we see a little bit of a will, but I think we are ourselves waiting for some concrete action towards this.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I could add is, even as we speak today, recently the Juvenile Justice Act was amended, and even now adoption guidelines in India are being relooked at, where we are trying our best to give ideas on what more can be done to streamline these guidelines. The government is open to it. They are recognizing the right to family, but it's not going to be sufficient for the central government to be open, or even the state government, unless it reaches the shelters where actually the work is going to happen. It's going to be hard for any one government to do much. But yes, we see at least an appreciation and understanding, and we hope that will continue. There's a question on what would it take to set up something like this with Delhi government, and somebody's based in Delhi and wants to know how do we do the same in Delhi.
So Jaspreet, there are two ways of doing it. Well, for the very first thing is for the Delhi government to be open to it. We cannot do our work without the approval of the Women and Child Development Commissionerate or Women and Child Development Department of any specific state or union territory. So first of all, we would need a contact in Delhi government, a decision-making contact, who can look at our work and decide that, yes, this is something that they will give approval for to be done in Delhi. So that's the first part of it, the government's will for giving approval and how much they want to support it in terms of resources as well. So that's the government's call. Now, so once that is in place, then we can work with the government to either work directly, or we can also enable another NGO to do the same work as we do. So the way we work is our technology is open source. All of our trainings and processes, we document it, and we are willing to share it with any other NGO who wants to do the exact same work. So if there is an NGO who wants to do this work, we can share our technology, our resources, our training, and they can implement the exact same work in Delhi, or we can do this work directly in Delhi as well. What is needed is essentially approval and resource support from the Delhi government.
What has worked in Maharashtra and Telangana is that they were willing to do a pilot. And because pilot showed results, they gave us approvals for pan state. Now, maybe that's one way we could approach the Delhi government, if you have the right contacts in WCD, to say that try a pilot, see the results, expand it. Maybe that's one way we could do it. Lot more questions, Nidhi. Which one would you like to pick? How about this? Any trends that you've seen, you've witnessed since we started working? Smriti, it's been what, more than 5 years since we've been working in the space?
Yes.
What's changing? What's changing in the adoption space in terms of mindset, whatever?
Sure. Before I answer that, I just want to say I just messaged everybody our email ID. So just in case, there's something we answer and you have a follow-up or something you want to reach out to us, you can please write to us at that email ID. So trends, difference. So I would say, I think, so I'll give you an example to show a trend. Couple of years ago, when we went to some adoption agencies, child shelters, government officials, and talked about technology, technology-enabled groundwork to help bring kids into the legal adoption pool. I think everybody kind of looked at us as, we are from outer space. Like, what are you guys talking about? This is not how the system works. This is how nothing works. It just seemed like, we were like speaking a different language. So that's the initial reaction we had gotten at the time. Like, some people would tell us, oh, there are no children in shelters who would go into adoption. All of them have parents, which is not true. But those are some of the comments we'll get. It was just something, basically some people telling us this work either cannot be done or, this work is not being needed, some version. Whereas now, when I talk to the same agencies, the same shelters, some of the same officials, they are looking at it very differently. Because now they have seen kids come into the legal adoption process, they're basically saying, hey, this is great work. Let's do more of it. So I think that shift has happened in places where we have done this work. But that shift needs to happen pan-India.
And it has to sustain as well.
It has to sustain.
Right? It just can't be one flash in the pan. Also, I think in terms of the adoptive parents, there's been a change where adoptive parents are more open to older children adoption, which is what happens when a child spends a lot of time in the shelter. The age he grows, and then the attractive age for adoption he misses out on. But things are changing drastically. Elder children are getting adopted today. CARA has become more open to at least hear us out to say what changes can be brought in the guidelines. So I think what's happening differently in the last 5 years is now we are getting calls where we would be standing and knocking on the doors. Now people want to know what's happening and how we can make this better. And there is an understanding that right to family is important for children. This was one very interesting question. So somebody's asked, though we mentioned Sakshi, but there are so many other children we meet, right? Of course, we can't take names or identify them in any way. But are there any children which was heartbreaking, we couldn't help them? And are there any children we continue to help? What would you share? Are you muted? I can't hear you.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. So yes, there are other cases like Sakshi, other cases where we have worked on, where we have brought older children, some children with special needs also into the legal adoption process, into the legal adoption pool. So there are heartbreaking stories as well. And I think a lot of these heartbreaking stories go back to what we believe are policy changes that need to happen. So for example, we worked on the cases of two sisters, two girls. And we did most of the process for them. We were done through like most of the process, and then the local district child protection unit found somebody who was claiming to be the mother, and that person had no intention of taking the girls home. The girls weren't visited for the last 4 years. Nothing was going to happen with that family, but we couldn't proceed with the case further. So local authorities, even if there is some indication of a family somewhere, irrespective of whether they have not met the child, even if they had abused the child, even if they don't want the child, as long as there's some semblance of a family there, they will, we can't proceed with those cases. So those cases are always heartbreaking. I must say, in those cases, currently, the only way children can come into the legal adoption pool if the families legally relinquish the child. So, but in many cases, relatives or parents who are not interested, they wouldn't even care enough to come to the local child welfare committee and legally relinquish the child, right? Like, they wouldn't even take that step. Or they may want to keep the kid there till the kid is 18 and then, take over the kid, take the kid home, whatever their intention may be. But yes, it's very heartbreaking to see kids in shelters who are not being visited, whose relatives or whose parents don't want them, but we can't do anything for those children. even though those children see other kids going home to their families.
The worst one for me was this child who was brought into the shelter when he was just 3 days old. Today, he's 17 years old. We've processed the case. We've declared the child legally free for adoption, but there's very less chance of the child being adopted by a family, and for no reason and no fault of his. This could have been so easily prevented, we feel. And those are the cases which really break your heart.
No, that's true. The delays are heartbreaking because we hope our work will reach a stage where, right now we are processing a lot of backlog, a lot of kids who have been in shelters for years. We are hoping our work and the awareness in India gets to a point where we start processing the children as soon as they reach a shelter. As soon as they reach a shelter, we say something wrong has happened. This child shouldn't have ended up in a shelter. Something wrong has happened. So let's see what is next for this child. And we do it with urgency. We do it with a lot of will. And our focus is always on ensuring that the child gets a family. Now, there are cases where, children will not reach families. Some kids may not get adopted. Some kids may not be able to come into the legal adoption pool, which is why, good shelters where children can thrive exist in India and may continue to exist going forward. But the idea is that can't be the final place for the child. Those have to be transition centers where each child is constantly evaluated. And if there is a next step, that next step should happen. So like Pratima said, we have seen children. In fact, we have even seen children who were, most of whose paperwork is done. Most of whose paperwork is done. There was just one last thing that was not done. So the boy came into the shelter when he was 5 years old or 4 years old, or some girl came into the shelter when she was 6 years old, because nothing was done for them. One last step wasn't done for them. They're still in the shelter at 12, 13, 14. So even now, when we do the last step for them, the chances of them getting adopted has gone down a bit. Because as the kids get older, the adoption rate also declines a bit. Even though adoption is getting better, still, there's a difference in adoption rate by age. And the second thing is, it's so much harder for the child to make that transition. See, we may, whatever the quality may be of the shelter, that is where the child has lived their entire life. So if you put a child in a shelter at 5 and then try to place them with a family at 12, you can do that, but it's so hard for the child. And the family has to be so mature and so understanding. So why make the child go through all that emotional trauma? If they were, they could have been processed at 5, let's process them at 5.
I think somebody wants to know which city in Maharashtra is being covered. So, I can't see your name, but we started with Aurangabad, Mumbai suburban, and now we have access to the entire state. So hopefully, fingers crossed, funds raised in the right manner. Next month, we would start Pune, Yavatmal, and in the coming months, more and more districts of Maharashtra would be added.
And I do want to say Mumbai city is also being covered through ASA, Bal Asha Trust. They are a very well-known, very well-established adoption agency, and they are linked to the child shelters in Mumbai city. So they are taking this in Mumbai city, and eventually they'll take over the entire Mumbai metropolitan area and then go forward from there. So, those type of partnerships are also important for us when other NGOs who have understanding of this space also start taking what we have and start doing that work in their areas.
So there are a couple of questions from Shruti. Let's take that and see if we can answer. Waiting period for Indian adoptive parents in the UK looking to adopt from India is 3 years and increasing. Yeah. Delay is distressing for Indians abroad. We feel quite helpless. Do you see the situation improving for Indian parents abroad? And I think she's asked one more question. Would gender and age impact the waiting period?
So I'll answer the second one first. So yes, gender and age perhaps would impact. And, I don't know how much gender impacts at this point, because what happens is there are more girls perhaps who come into shelters than boys, but at the same time, more girls get adopted than boys. So I think that sort of balances itself out. That's just like my very layperson's view of it. So I would say age has a bigger impact. At this point, the bigger the age, the higher the age that you're comfortable with, the lower the waiting period most likely is gonna be. I think single children versus sibling makes a difference. If you're open to siblings, I think that also affects the waiting period. Now, to answer your first question, do you see the situation improving for Indian parents abroad? We really hope so. We really hope our work will expand, and not just us directly doing this work, but the knock-on effect of a mindset change. If mindset change happens, like for example, there's some states in my understanding who are already a little better at bringing kids from child shelters into the legal adoption pool. So as more and more states start doing this work themselves, there is more of a mindset change. Hopefully this wait time period will go down. Another thing I want to comment on, Shruti, is about this 3-year period. The other challenge, besides kids not coming from shelters into the legal adoption pool, is this issue of children being abandoned rather than surrendered. So you may have seen stories of, some child was left at, in the corner of the road, some child was left in a garbage dump and so on. In India, parents have a legal right to legally surrender their child at an adoption agency. So when they do that, the child immediately comes into the legal adoption pool. But when you have these abandonments, thousands of abandonments all over the country, many of those children don't survive. Many of those children get hurt, extensively hurt and require extensive medical care. Some of those children may come into the legal adoption pool. So that's another bigger challenge, creating awareness about surrendering a child in our country. If every single person in India was aware that child surrender is a possibility, then you are looking at few other thousands of children coming into the legal adoption pool rather than being abandoned.
There's a question on what's your vision for the future of WIC? Is it doing the same work pan-India or get into other aspects of adoption? I can try, Smriti, and then you can. We have a 5-year vision at the moment. Yes, definitely, we would like to cover pan-India. No child has to be left behind. So the whole idea is there should be a family for every child. Every eligible child who's at the shelter should be moved to the adoption pool. So that's number one for us, definitely. But there are so many other things which are needed to make this happen, other than just sending the field workers to do this work. How do we sustain this? We sustain this by making sure people are trained. We sustain this by creating technology for them, providing them with frameworks, easy methods of doing the same process. And that's how what our research wing is doing. We're also trying to work on a rating and ranking model for the shelters to figure out, to actually incentivize them to put children in the adoption pool and rate them on how they're doing in terms of right to family. How are they performing on those parameters, and whether we can use that to attract donations for them. So this entire incentive model is something that we'll have to work on and continue to work on children. Beyond adoption at the moment, I think let's get this done. It's a huge piece of work that has to be completed. We will at some point of time start looking beyond the children who are in the shelters. Right now, we're only processing children inside the shelters, but there are so many children that you and I see on the streets, homeless. There could be many more, which UNICEF reports say that there are 30 million children who are orphaned in our country. At some point of time, we will have to start thinking of how do we make sure that these children are also processed as quickly as possible and come to the formal system of adoption. Anything else, Smriti? Muted.
So that's good, Pratima. I do want to add and say, so you're right. This in itself, making sure that children who are abandoned and orphaned come into the legal adoption pool in child shelters and beyond, in itself is a pretty big task in our area of focus. Also, as we work in this system, we sometimes realize there are other aspects we need to work on, and that get added to our plate, our work, that we hadn't realized earlier. So one of the things we are realizing we may have to look at is like whether adoptive parents who are adopting older children are truly trained for it, because we are bringing these kids into the legal adoption pool. And I think most of the adoption agencies historically have been used to handling younger children. So if the kids over 6, over 9, pre-teens, teens are going into adoption, the agencies really, really need to prepare the parents well. And is there good training material for that? Is that level of training happening? Is that level of vetting of parents happening? Specifically domestically, I know internationally that vetting happens, that training happens, but now how do we bring that to India? So that's something also we may have to look at as more older kids come into the legal adoption pool.
Okay. 2 questions. One, we'll take Anushri's question where she's asking, has there been a third-party recognition of our work, any accolades from that side? So Anushri, I think maybe I can begin by saying that last year, WAIC was incubated at Nudge Foundation. Out of 500 applications, they choose about 10 to 15 every year. We made the cut, and we've been incubated at Nudge Foundation, who've been helping us and mentoring us in expanding the solution and making sure we create a much more matured organization from here now. So that's one big thing that has happened for us. And now we're being considered for many other grants and incubations. We'll keep putting out more information on the social media channels as we get them. There's a question from Radha again. Radha, yes, please keep them coming. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. What concrete things are being tried to change right now on the policy standpoint? Do you want to know how we are trying to influence the government policies? I think what we realized was that what was missing was good quality research. So we had a dedicated team research good practices across the world. We benchmarked US to see what happens differently there. What are their thoughts and their methods on a permanent plan for the child? How is foster care looked at? How's adoption looked at? How's institutional care looked at? I can't get into too many details here right now, but we've picked up about 6 changes that we've suggested to the central government. We've released a white paper and made presentations where they're considering these changes to see whether they can be made in the guidelines. Most of them have to do with visitation rights, frequency of adoption, even termination of parental rights when the parent is found to be abusive, neglectful, or just not there for the child. So there are many things there. We'll be more than happy to take you through all that. And when we are in a position to put out more information on social media around this, we would be more than happy to release small snippets to say what's being suggested to the government.
Yeah. Then there is an interesting question from Dhanashri.
Yep.
She's saying that we still see a lot of people essentially offering to give their child for money, and instead of surrendering the child in a shelter. Can something be done, or should even be some sort of compensation be introduced so that this so it's not illegal adoption, but somehow they are still encouraged to legally surrender? So Dhanishri, it's a good question. I think something definitely needs to be done in this area, because as you said, that it's a reality that people who, not everybody may surrender their child, and somebody who wants to surrender their child may be looking at, let's say, even, let's look at it as support for the rest of their family. So I would not be able to say too much, because this is not an area we have specifically researched, right? Like a surrender versus compensation and so on. I know in India, it may also look at, hey, if you're giving money to people, they're just gonna give up their children. I don't know. I don't think that necessarily that how it happens. If somebody wants to raise their child, they will raise their child no matter what. But I think maybe this is where India needs to look at the best practice in some of the other countries. So, for example, my understanding is that if it's a parent-to-parent adoption, where a parent is giving their child to another parent, in many countries, the adoptive parent can sometimes pay for the medical fees of the mother who's giving birth. They can pay for her hospital stay. They may help for her groceries and other things while she's carrying the child. So there are other ways, there are other good ways to make sure that the family who's perhaps surrendering their child, the rest of their children are taken care of, or that family is taken care of. But what those good ways are, I think that needs to be further looked into. But it's a fair point that can we do something that encourages people to say, let me not abandon somebody who's going to abandon their child. What would it take to make sure they'll surrender it? Or somebody who's going to sell their child, what's a good way to ensure that they'll surrender the child? So can we put some good practices in place where the parents surrendering the child perhaps is better able to take care of their family, whether it's education for their other kids or something else that stops them from abandoning or selling the child? Pratima, if you have any, this is like an open-ended question. We don't work in this area, but it's a very important question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think that's enough. Okay. Somebody wants to know how social media helped us in raising awareness, how it can be leveraged to raise awareness enough for government to upgrade their policies. I have a very mixed response to this. Social media is extremely helpful for raising public awareness. People like you and me trying to understand more about the topic, the subject. It also can be used to highlight the inefficiencies which are there. But I think what really works and what we've seen work is when we take a very solution-oriented approach and approach the government, sit down, understand from their point of view where they're stuck, show them how our work makes their work easier. Right? Because the work that we do actually provides such simple dashboards to the DCPU officers, WCD commissioners. They are able to quickly look at the number. They're able to quickly take decisions on these children. CWC is able to take decisions on these children. When we proved that to the government, that has made them more open to the suggestions we had and more open to the policy changes that we were trying to do. So I think it's a very collaborative, solution-based approach that we have to take when we work with the government. Merely using social media to put pressure, I don't think that suffices.
There is a question by Santavna. How many children's life have seen a positive impact by our work since last 3 years? So Santavna, the first 2 years of our work were actually about doing ground research. We did a study in Pune. We did an extensive 1-year study in Pune. And we produced a report on what needs to be done. And through that study, where the technology is needed, how the technology is needed, and what more needs to be done in terms of implementation came out. So the first 2 years were about understanding the ground reality, doing the research, building out the technology. And in the past 6 to 9 months, when we have deployed the solution on the ground, when we have deployed the technology-enabled groundwork by our social workers, directly more than 100 children have come into the legal adoption pool. Indirectly, we have also brought other children to the attention of the authorities. So for example, in Telangana, besides the kids who came into the legal adoption pool, we highlighted children who were not being visited by their families. So a fresh social investigation was initiated for them. And the children, we also highlighted children in which cases have been sheltered for a very long time, even though there was a guardian on paper. So these are the type of things which then child welfare committees and DCPUs, local district units can look at and see, okay, well, what else can we do for this child if the child is not going to come into the legal adoption pool. So indirectly, we have brought attention to this issue to the local authorities, and directly in the last 6 to 9 months, more than 100 kids have gone into the legal adoption pool. I'm just going through to make sure we didn't miss anything.
Yeah. There is a question about moving abroad during your 3-year wait. I think it's post-adoption, post-registration question.
Post home study, I think. Okay, so for this question, please do write to us at team at WIC, because this is partly about the area where kids come into the legal adoption pool. So for the matching process and the parents process, you can write to us, and we can also suggest name of some other NGOs who actually do adoption counseling and can guide you better, specifically in this area. So please just drop that question to us via email.
I think we've answered.
Yes, I think we have.
Well, thank you so much for asking all these questions. One new message.
Okay, so Shruti is asking, the orphanages generally, they have to deal with less resources,
yes.
impact children. Are you working with the orphanages to address this? So Shruti, what you're talking about are essentially called child services. There are some other NGOs that are working in this area. We are not specifically working on, working with the with the shelters on the children who are living there. Our work is related to bringing kids into the legal adoption pool, but there are other NGOs. Now, that said, I would say, the idea of having little resources and it impacting child development is extremely true. One simple example is, let's say a 12-year-old child gets adopted today. The parent may expect that it's a 12-year-old child, so her level of understanding may be at a 5th or 6th grade level in terms of education. But they'll find that the child, does not have the understanding even of, the 1st grade level. So the parents will have to make sure that the child gets the education from childhood onwards, irrespective of the age of the child. So that's one clear impact we see on child's development, where they are left behind. They go to schools, they come back, but the actual learning, actual knowledge doesn't come. There are health impacts, there are psychological impacts. So all of that is there. You're right, there are other NGOs working on this, but I think a lot more. And this is why children getting to families is important. Once a child is with a family, it's the family's responsibility to provide all this to a child, all these services to a child. Whereas in shelters, those child services, the quality of them really varies based on how well resourced the shelter is and how understanding the shelter is about the child's development.
Yes. So
okay, so Preeti's question is, do we work on children under 4?
Under 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes,
Very much.
yes, very much. Specifically in Telangana, we also not only worked with CCIs, we also worked with the governments are there. So in many states, the adoption agencies are private, whereas in Telangana, the adoption agencies are government run. So we worked with the government agencies there on kids whose age is under 4 as well. And in many cases, we see siblings. So the older child may be 8 years old and the younger brother or sister is 3 or 4. So it depends. And another thing we have seen is even though kids above 6 are supposed to be in child shelters, in the cities in which we have encountered children under 6 years of age, as young as 3 years of age in child shelters. Some child shelters may have some special permission for that. So yes, we do encounter younger children, and we work on children irrespective of age. Let me put it that way. So whichever children we encounter in the shelters we work, if they're abandoned and orphaned, we will work on their case.
Just one last thing, I think, from my side, and if there's still more questions, you can always write to us. I did share the Razorpay link, which I'm sharing again, in case any of you would like to donate. There's one more way you can help us. If you are working in an organization that is looking at institutional funding, CSR funding, and you can introduce us. Within a week's time, I think WIC is going to be eligible for receiving CSR funding also. So if there are any contacts you can help us with, where your organizations are looking to support an NGO on CSR, that will also be extremely helpful. Smriti has also put the donate page, which will lead you to the Razorpay, and you have it here in case you think that this is something you would like to support. We are more than happy for any amount that we can receive from you. I don't see any more questions. Should we close, Smriti?
Just checking.
There's one: who looks after education of children who are in government home beyond a certain age? Shelters are responsible to send the children to school. Yes, there are many NGOs also who work with children and provide them inputs on education. But that's not an area that we are working towards. We're trying our best to get the children out of the shelters. So yeah, that's where our focus is.
So, and she's asking beyond a certain age. So maybe Disha, you're asking for above 18. Well, again, it's very, very shelter dependent. Some shelters may have the resources to send them to college. Other shelters may not. It varies widely. There are no guarantees. Then one last question from Santamna: what message do you have for someone considering donating to WIC? I think what I say, like, Pratham has already talked about us expanding and, using the funds to help process as many children as possible. The other way I also look at it, like the people who work for us, who are our social workers, they are also, many of them also have a very strong attachment to this cause. Many, one of our very, very key social workers in Maharashtra, he's himself a care leaver, as in he himself grew up in child shelters, and thankfully, he's a project manager for WIC. So even when these people are social, you're in a way supporting our field workers as well. So it's not just the children, you're also supporting our field workers and people who are doing this work, very hard work, day in and day out.
Thank you so much, all of you. I don't know, Bhuvneshwari, if you're writing something more, I can see a hi, so hi back to you, but thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for making time. Thanks for listening to us. Do follow us on our social media channels. We will keep putting out information that you can look at. Talk about us to your friends, your families, and if there's any interest that you can get us on funding, institutional funding, we would be extremely happy to take that on. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.